About 10 years ago, I was living in Toronto, me and my wife, and one night I had a very, very vivid dream about the Wizard of Oz. It was the first time in my life I had ever got up in the middle of the night. I literally checked to see if I was a girl, because in the dream I was a young girl named Darlin. I started jotting stuff down, and then after that, I was motivated to write a book. I haven't done anything with it. I've learned a lot about the world, woken up since then, and I just wanted to share a little bit of this because I know me and my family, we were big on the Wizard of Oz. Um, Pretty much everyone in the family was. And for some reason, I just never wanted to publish this or go any further with it. I just put it aside. Thank God for that now. But so what I'm going to do is do a little reading from it. And it's a quite the big book. So I'm not going to put you through all of that. But so basically, the story takes place so far. I'll bring you up to speed. Basically, there's this young girl named Darlin. She's a very rich heiress, I guess you would say. 16, just about to turn 16 years old. Her mother is a Hollywood elite person, and her grandmother happens to be the owner of like a Dow Chemical Company, the biggest company in the world, uh, specializing in housewares all the way to military in this story. Now, in this story, Darlin's attending, what do you call it, private school for like bad kids. And this time she's been moved around all sorts of private schools, and she ends up in Kansas. And an hour away from her school is her grandmother's house. Now, she's never been to her grandmother's house, but she's seen it on TV and everything, because it's like her grandmother built this castle, actually tore down a castle in Europe and moved it stone by stone, and built this huge, it's the most amazing castle in the world, but it happens to be in Kansas now. Now, in the story, Darling goes to the house. And as she's visiting at her grandmother's house, there's all sorts of adventure up to here, but she basically sneaks out and goes through like a secret passage, ends up finding this room that's locked, and inside the room it's built in like an egg shape, and it's all yellow bricks. That's what it is. Inside there's all sorts of witch stuff and all that. She's freaked out. While she's rummaging around, she had found an old handwritten script of the book for Wizard of Oz. She then basically she ends up getting out of the after just learning a few things. Has to go back to the room because she took something with her that she didn't want her grandmother to find out. And this is where I'm picking up in the story here. So I'm just going to start to read. Darlin's in her room in the middle of a castle. Oh yeah, one other thing. Her grandmother is a really old lady, really old. She's all of her workers are all midgets, and she has a huge grounds, and it's a very, very weird place. Really, you have to read the book to get to here, but I just wanted you to get the gist of what the story was about. So this is Darlin's second time going into the passages. She can now see the passage was more clearly because she had a flashlight. Now a little more familiar with the tunnel system, she made her way quickly down to the fork in the road. She thought there's no way she was going to go upstairs first. She might have to take that slide all the way back down and probably land on her grandmother this time while she was sleeping, and that's the last thing she wanted. Pause. The first time she got out of the room, she had hit a trap door and slid down, and it brought right into her grandmother's bedroom. So she laughed at the thought of landing on her grandmother, and then decided to go back to the gold room. When she got there, she could still see the orange glow from the fire burning in the room. Knowing better this time, she knelt down and put her arm in the lower hole so that she wouldn't get her arm stuck. A few seconds later, the secret entrance opened. The smoke from the cauldron billowed out of the room and the exhaust vents of the passage as it did the first time. Darlin shined the flashlight into the room. The white light lit up the bricks bright gold and like she had never seen the first time. It was hard for her to look at it so quickly, so she shut off the flashlight as it had blinded her. When the secret door closed itself behind her, she placed Disco on the floor and went to the table with the purple and green test tubes. The first time in the room, she found this room because she was trying to find her little dog Disco, who would run down this passage, and that's how this whole thing started. She started her investigating by looking at the spell book. She turned to the page that read Cyclone Ride. Darlin skimmed down the page and seen the ingredients list for the spell. She shook her head and took a picture with her cell phone and then turned a few pages over. This spell was called Invention. Darlin shook her head in disbelief. She couldn't believe it. She really couldn't. Not only was her grandmother a Wizard of Oz freak who had all these things that she's been collecting over the years, this was an authentic spell book, and she knew it. Darlin turned around and took a picture of a globe-like structure covered with a red sheet. She dare not peek under it, because she remembered back when she was 4 years old, an episode with that ball. Carefully, Darlin walked around the cauldron and read a spell that was placed on the easel or podium or whatever it was called. The spell was called Vanity. Darlin, very curious about this, took the time to read the entire spell. She was shocked to discover that the hair from a 16-year-old was one of the ingredients necessary. Thinking about it for a moment, she pulled out her grandma's card and read over it. It said that she would have to wait until her actual birthday for her present, but that it would be worth waiting for. Darlin stepped back in horror as she realized that this spell was going to be for her. Vanity? She couldn't think how it would work. She didn't understand. What would it do? What I don't understand it. She's scratching her head. This lady is crazy. Going over to the old china cabinet, she began to take look at some of the labels of the bottles and the bags, taking pictures of the most interesting. As she rifled through a few of the bottles, she came across one of Victoria's 16th. Almost dropping it as she read it, caught in the place of the cabinet, she took it as a picture and then put it back. Victoria is Darlin's mother. Darlin's mother is a very selfish woman who's just about herself and never had time for Darlin. She then thought Maybe her grandmother was just a crazy old woman who liked to play witch or something. She was hoping that this wasn't really true. If she had Darlin's mother's hair from when she was 16 and used it back then on her, she was okay because her mother was living an okay life. She was great. She had all the money in the world and all the fame. With this line of thinking, Darlin would have nothing to worry about. She thought to herself, maybe she's just crazy. Feeling a little better, she turned around and went over to the black silk curtains. Now, earlier in the book, just before she left the room, she peeked behind this black silk curtains and she seen a statue of the Tin Man. Darlin reached up and split the curtains apart, revealing the Tin Man statue. She studied him more closely this time, looking at his facial features. She realized this was a very lifelike statue. She heard a ticking and realized that it was coming from within the Tin Man's chest. Darlin took her hand and made a fist, then banged the Tin Man's chest. Bong, bong, bong. There was a loud echo, just like in the movie. Darlin banged 3 more times. Bong, bong, bong. And the hollow sound was comparable to a bell. Suddenly, she heard the Tin Man squeak. Darlin, startled, jumped back, but for some reason she wasn't scared. She approached him again and confirmed that she was not crazy or imagining it when his eyes were following her in the room. She noticed he had lots of rust around his eyes. Darlin took a big step to the left and watched as the eyes followed. Her eyes seemed to smile at the possibilities. She then took a step to the right and seeing his eyes move back. Almost in disbelief, she whispered to the statue, "Did you say oil can? Do you want me to oil you?" And the eyes seemed to light up. The jaw could not move, but a squeak of came out. The sound of his rusted metal lips squeaking together made Disco scared and run across the room and hide under a table. Darlin turned to her and motioned Disco to come back over. She then pulled the oil can off the table. Darlin stood up on the back of the small wooden box in which he was displayed on. She began to oil the sides of his jaws, lips, mouth. By the time Darlin went to oil the other side of the Tin Man's face, the Tin Man began to work his mouth free. "Thank you," he squeaked. "I've been rusted here for over 100 years." Darlin couldn't believe what she was seeing or hearing. She thought her eyes must be playing tricks on her, her ears must be messing with her. Was she dreaming? Darlin proceeded to ask, "How is this happening? How are you real? I don't understand." "Keep oiling my joints, I'll tell you, Darlin," pleaded the Tin Man. Darlin's jaw dropped when she heard her name. "How do you know my name?" she asked as he continued to oil his joints, first oiling the rest of his face, then starting on his neck. "Darlin, I know everything about you. I'm friends with your grandmother, Dorothy, who is stuck desolate in Oz. We must help her." Tin Man moving his jaw and neck around, trying to get free. "My grandmother? What the heck are you talking about, Darlin?" "Yes, your grandmother. You didn't really think that wicked old witch was your grandmother, did you? Dorothy needs us. They all need us. Oz is in trouble." Darlin, dumbfounded, stepped back. And after Darlin oiled all the joints and began to work his joints by moving as much as she could, he stepped off the box he had been standing frozen on and motioned for more oil, pointing to his knees, just like in the movie. After a little bit of oiling his elbows and that, he lowered his axe and made a very gratifying expression. He turned to her and said, "I think you need to sit down." Darlin took a seat on the wooden box that he was standing on. She listened to him try to inform her as best he could. It was all very confusing. But as she sat there listening to him tell her about Oz and her grandmother, everything she's seen and learned slowly started to make sense. Darlin learned that the lady posing as her grandmother was really the Wicked Witch of the South, the last of the three triplet sisters that terrified Oz for many years. After the events that took documented in the movie, Dorothy used the ruby slippers to visit Oz for many years. Break. This is one other thing. When I was young, I remember seeing a scene in the movie where after she comes back, and she's like telling everyone, "Oh, it was real. It's a real place," and all that. And they're like, "Oh yeah, Dorothy." Well, in this scene that I seen, that no one else seen, so I'm assuming it was a dream from Satan too. Um, uh, she pulled up. She's in the brown and white sepia, and she pulls her blanket, and she still had the ruby slippers on. That's like part one, about 35 years ago. This one is 10 years ago. So I'll continue. After Dorothy continued using the ruby slippers to visit Oz for many years. Dorothy basically grew up into a beautiful young lady in both of the lands. After many years of deep and powerful friendship, the Scarecrow and her fell deeply in love. The movie, it did not show this, but after the melting of the Wicked Witch of the West, it wasn't just the broomstick that they had brought back to the wizard. They had also collected the spell books of both the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wicked Witch of the East, and gave them to the wizard. They were stored safely in the great archives of the Emerald City under strict guard. Dorothy and the Scarecrow were eventually married in Emerald City by their good friend the wizard. Dorothy knew the ruby slippers were capable of a lot more magic than she was capable of. Dorothy and the Scarecrow spent their honeymoon up in the tallest tower of the Emerald City going through the spell books. Once she learned about the spell books, a lot more made sense. They were searching for a way to bring him along with her back to Kansas. Through reading this, Dorothy realized that she had some of the properties of being a witch. Dorothy really wanted nothing more than to bring her new husband back to Kansas so that the Scarecrow could finally meet Auntie Em and Uncle Henry. The Wicked Witch of the West books was not as much use to them. It was just a gathering of different spells. But when they learned a great deal more from the Wicked Witch of the East spellbook. You see, the Wicked Witch of the East spellbook was a lot more scientifically done. It contained dates showing a series of trial and error experiments. The witch's goal that she was trying to reach was to be able to bring objects as well as multiple people through the portal between Kansas and Oz. In one of the witch's early experiments, she had documented one big regret. She accidentally brought a man to Oz who happened to have his hot air balloon caught in the eye of one of her tornadoes, of her twisters. This man, they realized, was the Wizard of Oz. So in actuality, it wasn't the Wizard of Oz who accidentally went to Kansas. He was caught up in one of the tornado spells and brought to Kansas by accident. After the full explanation of the diary portion of her spellbook, Dorothy learned that her neighbor, Mrs. Gulch, was really the Wicked Witch of the East. She had been using the ruby slippers to go back and forth from Kansas to Oz for over 23 years. The last spell in the book was called Cyclone Riding. And the spell consisted of soil from a different land, included a wand, and as well as ruby slippers. After reading this, Dorothy concluded that it wasn't just dumb luck that brought her to Oz in the first place. It was Mrs. Gulch. She must have been very, very angry about Toto getting into her garden and getting away from her that day on the bike. So when she went home and she decided, so that Wicked Witch of the East, Mrs. Gulch, went home and decided to who better test her spell on than that little annoying neighbor, Dorothy, and her little dog, too. From reading the spell, Dorothy knew how the witch had did it. When the Wicked Witch of the East would have threw soil from Oz up into the air, suspending it in midair by swirling her wand around, starting with small circles, then going larger circles. She would have turned the hand full of soil into a twister, then clicking her heels together and picturing Dorothy's ranch, she was able to bring up the twister and bring Dorothy into the land of Oz. Her only mistake was that she should have only thought that Dorothy and Toto her only mistake was that she should have only thought of Dorothy and Toro. By thinking of the house, she had taken on too much. Oh yes. The house was more than she could handle with this spell. As you know from the movie, it landed on the Wicked Witch of the East, causing her death. Dorothy realized that after her meeting with the Wicked Witch of the West in Munchkinland, when Glinda, the Good Witch of the North, had sent her off, she must have went to her sister's castle and taken her dead sister's spellbook. Basically, after the meeting in the Wizard of Oz, where the Wicked Witch of the West, she's like, "Get out of here! You have no power," and then she takes off. Well, where she went was directly to her Wicked Witch of the East castle. She wanted to get that. She knew that her sister was working on something, and she wanted to get that spellbook. Dorothy knew there was no magic in our world. She's seen Mrs. Gulch turn into a witch in the Twister on the first trip to Oz. She performed a series of test flights bringing magical items from Oz, like the talking flowers in the Munchkin land. She learned that when they went through the portal to Kansas, they lost their magic. These singing flowers would just become ordinary flowers. She also learned that when she went back to Oz, they became magical again. Eventually, she built up enough nerve and brought the Scarecrow through the portal with her. When they reached Kansas, he had already turned into a normal man. After meeting Auntie Em and Uncle Henry, he obtained a job as a professor at the University of Kansas, and they had a baby girl named Victoria. This is Darlin's mother. At first, they did not want to bring the baby through the Twister to the land of Oz. Dorothy was very protective of her daughter and was a very good mother. On Victoria's 4th birthday, they finally brought her to Oz to meet all of her long-awaited friends. At the time, Dorothy and the Scarecrow had been away from Oz for over 4 years. They did not know that the last of the three triplets witches, the Wicked Witch of the South, had broken into the archives of the Emerald City and had stolen her sister's spellbook. The Wicked Witch of the South had studied and learnt how to use the cyclone spell as well. She plotted and waited for Dorothy's return so that she could steal the ruby slippers to get her final revenge. Dorothy, feeling very, very safe in the towers of the Emerald City, took a shower, leaving the ruby slippers on her bed. It was then that the Wicked Witch of the South snuck into the room, disguised as a cleaning lady, and stole the ruby slippers. Not knowing what to do, Dorothy and the Scarecrow, along with their two best friends, the Tin Man and the Lion, used talking puddle used the talking puddle located in the basement of the Emerald City to locate the witch who was in Munchkinland. The Scarecrow stayed with his daughter. He was now a scarecrow again because he came back to Oz. And the other three traveled to Munchkinland to try and retrieve the ruby slippers. Upon arriving in Munchkinland, they seen that they were too late. The Wicked Witch of the South had already started the cyclone spell. The lion, with such bravery, charged at her, but was knocked unconscious and blown from the witch's wand. She magically formed a rain cloud above the Tin Man, causing him to rust instantly. Her skills, the Wicked Witch of the South, was way better than anyone else's. Dorothy barely escaped behind a munchkin hut as the witch was casting fireballs in her direction. She must have tripped or hit her head or something, because she woke up hours later and everything in Oz was different. The munchkins were all missing, and here was no sign of the Tin Man or the Lion. The Wicked Witch of the West had kidnapped them, along with part of the yellow brick road. There was no magic left in Oz, and all the talking trees and flowers had wilted away, and the sky had turned dark gray. With an empty, magicless Oz, Dorothy made her way back the hard way to the Emerald City. When Dorothy finally got there, she found her husband had turned into nothing more than a bag of hay. Everything in the whole land of Oz that had magic simply lost it. Dorothy, along with her 4-year-old daughter, was stuck in a magicless Oz, never aging, uncertain of what was to come. Now, Darling sat up in disbelief. This was a lot for her to handle. She looked up at the Tin Man. If my mom is trapped in Oz, stuck there as a 4-year-old, then how is she here in this castle? The Tin Man searched for the words for a few seconds, then began to explain. As you know, the witch is pure evil. She kept me frozen on that box for who knows how long. She would only draw the curtains back every now and then. It was her way of torturing me, to update me of all the evil she was doing, and all the evil she's done in your land as well. Her real favorite is to tell me about the state of Oz. She knew what Oz means to me. You see, the witch knows that I have a big heart and finds it very amusing to see me cry. My mother, Tin Man, persisted Darling. Oh yes, I was getting to that. One day about 50, 60 years ago, the witch drew my curtains, as she often did, then looked into her crystal ball. Darling turned around and noticed the silk covered was the crystal ball. Well, on that particular day, shamelessly pointing out desolate shape of the land of Oz, she asked her crystal ball to show Dorothy. She loved nothing more than to watch Dorothy in her misery. But when it appeared this time, instead of being sad, she had your mother. Dorothy had your mother on her lap and was singing her favorite song. Somewhere over the rainbow. This enraged the Wicked Witch. I could see the green skin cringe around her black eyes. Darlin interrupted. Green skin? Wait a minute. She doesn't have green skin. The Tin Man continued. Oh, yes, she does. The minute she leaves this room, it disappears. This room, the magic appears. This is the only bit of Oz that exists. Anyway, what I was saying, she became enraged with the fact that Dorothy still found happiness with her baby Victoria. And that she then used the ruby slippers to immediately go back to Oz. I stood there and watched the crystal ball as she left the curtains open. I was fixed on Dorothy and your mom. Helplessly, I watched the witch appear behind Dorothy. In my head, I was screaming, "Look out, look out!" But my mouth was rusted, and I was looking at a crystal ball. She could not hear me. The Wicked Witch of the South grabbed your mother, who was only 4 years old then, pushed Dorothy to the ground, waved to me, and as she knew I could do nothing but watch the crystal ball. This is the kind of twisted lady she is. She then threw some sort of dust into the air and used her wand to spin into a mini twister, carrying Victoria back here to Earth. I don't understand why. The witch must have fogged her memory with a spell. She has raised her as her own child, and sorry to say, but she cannot be trusted. She was raised to be evil, just like the witch. Since that day, she has been exposed to the pleasures and greed, but somehow, because of her inherited goodness from Dorothy and the Scarecrow, it wasn't until your mother turned 16 that she was able to finally cast the vanity spell on her. The vanity, as the Tin Man explained this to Darlin walked over and pointed to the podium that had the vanity spell. Darlin was right. That spell was for her. For if she didn't find that this didn't go down this day, she would have been locked into a vain vanity spell where she would have never cared about anyone but herself till the end of days. She rose up off the box and went and examined it again. What does the spell do? She asked with a cringe. It masks all the good inside you by making you fall in love with yourself. Most importantly, the spell stopped the good witch of the North from being able to inform Victoria of the truth. Darlin began to break down with the spell in her hand, and tears slowly fell upon her. Why me? How can this be? Earlier you mentioned after the events of the movie, Dorothy visited Oz. What does the movie have to do with it? If my grandmother, this is fiction. How could it be truth? If my grandmother, the witch, wrote the book over 100 years ago and the movie was written many years later, how can the changes in the movie be more accurate than the actual book? The Tin Man, loosening his arms and legs, said, "Well, let me explain, because both are true to a certain point. When the witch first arrived here, she knew that magic would not work in the land of Kansas. She needed money to build her own yellow brick room so she could use her magic. So the first thing she did was go to Dorothy's ranch to see what she could steal. She found some of the notes for the story that Dorothy had been working on about her adventure in Oz. She stole them and filled in the unfinished pieces as best she could. Oh, I seen a copy of it up in the tower, but it's titled The Witches of Oz. I knew it was in her handwriting the moment she gave me my birthday card, Darlin explained. The Tin Man replied, "That's it. That's what she called it. Sold it to a writer named Frank Barnum, probably for his soul, who published it under his name. And I guess he didn't want to glamorize the witches, so he changed the title to The Wizard of Oz." "Oh my," said Darlin, just like her grandmother Dorothy would have. The witch did not want to be associated with the book at all, so she cast a spell on Frank after he had built the room for her, so that he would think that he actually came up with the story. Darlin interrupted, "But what about the differences in the movie?" The Tin Man answered, "Well, the movie is more accurate tale of what really happened. Glinda the Good Witch of the North told me that." "Wait a minute, you've talked to Glinda?" asked a still very puzzled Darlin as she put the witch's card back in her sash. "Well, not exactly. She told me I was unable to talk back as I was in a frozen state." Darlin, still in disbelief. "How?" A little frustrated, the Tin Man walked across the room and said, "You see this?" He pointed to the red-covered globe. "That's the crystal ball I was telling you about. Sometimes after the witch used it, she'd forget to cover it up and leaving the red curtain off of it. Once in a while, she was not around, and Glinda would appear to me." What is the difference? Glenda said that the lion who set it was the lion who set the record straight in the movie. He was the only one who knew about our songs, the poppies, and a few other things that were left out of the book. "The lion?" "Yes, the lion. Glinda told me the lion was pulled into the twister along with me, but somehow managed to escape before the witch knew that he had came through with us. Glinda had a hard time locating him. She searched for many years, and when Glinda seen the movie, she realized right away from the songs that he must have made his way to Hollywood. In your land, he became a regular man, just like the Scarecrow would. I believe he lost his courage along with his magic. Afraid to confront the witch, he moved to Hollywood, the place where dreams can come true, and began a life. So he became human too? That means if you left this room, that you would become human as well? Darlin inquired. If I were to leave this room, I just don't know what would happen to me. I'm a little more magical than a munchkin, or I might turn into a refrigerator or a beehive, he stated. How did my grandma, the witch, end up getting so rich? You mean the witch? She used the invention spells to create things to sell. She says money is what makes the world go round, whatever that means. Darlin gasped in disbelief. 24 hours ago, she was a normal person. Well, not quite normal teenager. And now she was the granddaughter of Dorothy and the Scarecrow, talking with a Tin Man in a magical room. And this would be a lot to take in for anybody. She was unsure if she was up to the task. Darlin watched as the Tin Man worked his